It started as a quiet ripple, barely a headline. Karoline Leavitt to speak at Westbridge University panel, a routine event, part of a youth political engagement tour organized by the university's civics department. But within hours, the announcement exploded across campus. Social media lit up with outrage. A Trump loyalist on our stage? She stands against everything this school believes in. We can't normalize her voice. By the following morning, posters reading, "Protest Hate, Reject Karoline," were taped across dorm walls and lecture halls. A student-run podcast host called her the embodiment of regressive politics with a pretty smile. The dean, caught between freedom of speech and student fury, released a cautious statement. Westbridge does not endorse any speaker's political views. We believe in dialogue, even when it's difficult. Karoline saw the noise. She read the tweets. And still, she confirmed, "I'll be there." Backstage, the atmosphere was tense. A small, velvet-curtained room served as her green room. Her blazer, a muted emerald tone, was freshly pressed. Her silver cross necklace rested just above the lapel. An assistant checked the mic. The student liaison, a nervously smiling senior named Dana, avoided eye contact. "There's been some pushback," Dana mumbled. Karoline nodded, calm. "Let them push." Inside the auditorium, over 300 students packed the seats. The walls buzzed with murmurs. Faculty lined the back rows like silent referees. Protest signs dotted the aisles. A large banner draped above the crowd read, "Our campus, our voice." When the host finally announced her name, a wave of hissing rose before she even stepped out. "Please welcome White House Press Secretary, Karoline Leavitt." Booing. Scattered jeers. One student stood with arms crossed, shouting, "Why is she even here?" Karoline stepped into the light slowly, heels clicking against the polished wood. She stopped center stage, smiled slightly, and waited. The silver cross at her neck gleamed. She didn't look shaken, only focused. The host leaned toward her mic, apologetic. "Ms. Leavitt, you may begin." Karoline surveyed the crowd for a long second, and then said with surprising warmth, "I was told I might not be welcome here. So first, thank you for still showing up, even when you disagree with me." There was no applause, only silence. But she had started. Karoline let the silence breathe for a moment longer, not rushing to fill it. She didn't need approval. She needed control. And control wasn't taken with volume. It was taken with precision. She stepped slightly forward, her voice even. "I didn't come here to convert anyone. I came here to speak. If you disagree with me, I respect that. But I ask one thing in return. Respect me enough to listen before you judge." That, ironically, drew laughter from a few in the back rows. Sharp, dismissive laughter. One student near the aisle stood up, voice loud. "Easy for you to say when you're on stage with a mic. You represent hate, Karoline. You spin division. We've read the headlines." Karoline turned to him gently. "And I've lived the consequences of those headlines being wrong." He sat slowly, not defeated, but wary. Karoline took a breath. "I've been called a puppet, a fascist, a liar, a blonde distraction. Not because people listened to what I believe, but because they assumed they already knew. Maybe some of you have already made that decision about me." A few nods. Some scoffs. "I'm not here to debate with labels," she continued. "I'm here to talk about ideas. Freedom of thought, freedom of speech, the kind of civil discourse that used to define universities like this one." That hit harder than she expected. A few faculty members shifted in their chairs. One professor, gray-bearded, skeptical, leaned forward, arms crossed. A hand shot up in the third row. A young woman in a denim jacket, skeptical eyes. "If you claim to support free speech, why defend someone like Trump, who attacked the press, disrespected immigrants, and mocked women?" Whispers rippled. Karoline didn't flinch. "I've disagreed with people I've worked with. Yes, even the president," she said clearly. "But I also saw firsthand how the media edited clips to mislead, how border policies were misrepresented, and how truth was weaponized to fit headlines. You want to talk about women? She added, voice rising just slightly. Try being a 24-year-old woman walking into the West Wing every day, told you're just a mouthpiece, while male interns got asked what they thought. That landed. Some students who had crossed their arms loosened them. Karoline scanned the crowd. I don't need you to agree with me. But if you're going to argue with me, make it about the real me, not the version someone else wrote for you. For the first time, a few in the front row looked unsure, not convinced, not converted, but unsure. The room wasn't hers yet, but she had cracked the door. The student in the denim jacket didn't sit back right away. Okay, she said, still skeptical. So you're saying the media misrepresented things. But what about your silence when immigrant families were separated? You didn't tweet. You didn't speak up. Doesn't silence equal complicity? The room tensed again. It was the question many had wanted to ask, and she had asked it without yelling, without venom, just raw, pointed doubt. Karoline stepped forward, her expression unreadable, but her eyes weren't cold. They were tired. You want the truth? She said, more softly than before. I cried the night I saw those images, and I begged for clarity. Not spin. Clarity. The audience hushed. But I also read the briefings. I saw the backlog. I read the reports of cartel trafficking, of children brought across the border by men who weren't their fathers. And I learned how messy and painful immigration policy truly is, not just morally but operationally. A pause. No one wins when the system fails. But when you tweet instead of act, when you perform instead of fix, you get more headlines and fewer solutions. Her tone wasn't defensive. It was exhausted, honest. The denim jacket student slowly sat back, still unsure, but no longer dismissive. The audience was shifting, not in agreement, but in attention. Another student stood, this one in a Bernie 2020 hoodie. You talk about truth, but your party plays with it. They deny climate change, they legislate women's bodies, they cut education. How can you defend that? Karoline exhaled, walking closer to the edge of the stage. I don't defend everything, she said plainly. But I fight from where I stand. And if I leave the room because I don't like one issue, I'll never fix the others. She looked directly at the student. Do you want people like me to disappear? Or do you want us to listen and maybe, just maybe, change something from the inside? That landed hard. The student didn't answer. A professor in the back whispered to a colleague, She's disarming them without pandering. Karoline returned to center stage. You're here tonight because you care, and so am I. The difference is, some of you came to protest, I came to participate, and I hope we can meet somewhere in between. A few scattered claps, nervous, hesitant, broke the quiet. It wasn't a victory, but it was the first sign of change. The scattered claps didn't last long, but they echoed far louder than the protest signs in the back. Karoline didn't flinch. She didn't celebrate either. She just let the moment hang, not forcing it into a soundbite. One of the faculty moderators leaned into the mic. Let's take one more student question before the open Q&A. A hand rose, a hesitant one, from near the aisle. A young man in a wheelchair, wearing a faded hoodie and glasses. His voice cracked slightly. I grew up in a town like yours, he began. Conservative, small. Everyone believed the same thing. I left because I felt invisible, gay, quiet, different. People like you didn't defend me. The auditorium stilled. Karoline looked at him, really looked. What's your name? She asked gently. Ethan. She stepped forward, kneeling slightly so her gaze was level with his. Ethan, she said, I'm sorry you were made to feel invisible. I won't pretend to understand everything you've been through, but I'll tell you this. No one deserves to feel erased, not for who they are or where they come from. He blinked, caught off guard. I was raised with faith, Karoline continued. But faith without compassion becomes cruelty, and that's not what I stand for. You deserved kindness, not exile. The room was quiet. No booze, no applause, just a long, loaded silence that said, "This was not expected." One student whispered to another, "Did she just apologize?" Karoline stood up straight again, but her posture wasn't defensive. It was open. "I came here to talk policy, not pain. But sometimes pain reveals more truth than any debate can." A professor in the front row, previously expressionless, nodded slightly. The atmosphere had changed. No longer was this a battleground. It had become a mirror. Karoline faced the crowd again. "I don't want to win arguments. I want to build bridges, even when it's hard, even when people think I don't belong in the conversation." Another round of hesitant applause, this time more sustained. She had just done something few had expected. Not defended herself, but connected with vulnerability, not rhetoric. And that's when something rare happened. A student stood, then another, then another. Not all, not most, but enough. Enough to make everyone else notice. Karoline stood still at center stage, watching the first handful of students slowly rise to their feet, not in protest, not in defiance, but in quiet acknowledgement. It wasn't a standing ovation. Not yet. But it was a rupture in the wall of resistance. Backstage, Dana, the student liaison, peeked out from behind the curtain. Her mouth fell open slightly. "They're standing?" she whispered. The faculty host shifted nervously in his chair. This wasn't what the university had prepared for. The plan was to give Karoline 5 minutes. Let her speak, then open to the student panel. Keep it balanced. But now the balance had tipped. Karoline didn't break the moment. She let it settle, her eyes scanning the faces. Some students still scowled. Some folded their arms tighter, unwilling to concede even curiosity. But others, especially in the middle rows, leaned forward now, not to attack, but to hear. That was everything. "I didn't expect applause," Karoline said, voice steady. "And I don't need it. What I came for was this. A room full of young people who don't agree with me, still willing to engage." She stepped closer to the edge of the stage. "Because here's the truth no one likes to say, disagreement isn't hate, silence isn't virtue, and outrage isn't the same as courage." Someone clapped. Then 2, then 10. Karoline smiled, but not with pride, with clarity. She continued. "You all believe in something. That's why you showed up. But belief without challenge is just comfort, and comfort doesn't change the world." The clapping grew louder. Not unanimous, but undeniable. She turned slightly toward the professors. "You teach students to think. That means inviting voices you don't like. That means tolerating truth that makes you uncomfortable. That's the price of democracy." The older professor in the front row finally cracked a smile. A small one, but it was there. Karoline looked back to the crowd. "I may never change your mind. And that's okay. But if I can change your assumption that someone like me is unworthy of being heard, then tonight mattered." In the back, a protest sign slipped from a student's hand. Not thrown, just let go. And for the first time there was no yelling, no boos, no tension humming in the rafters. Just something new. Respect. The kind you earn, not demand. Karoline took a slow breath. She had spent the last 20 minutes not persuading, but proving. Not with statistics or slogans, but with stillness, precision, and something no one had expected from her. Humility. One of the student moderators leaned into his mic. "Would you be willing to take another question?" Karoline nodded. "Only if it's honest." A murmur of laughter rippled, soft, but real. A student from the back row stood, a girl with dyed red hair, a stack of books in her arms, and eyes that had watched every word so far without blinking. "I came here to hate you," she said. "I really did." A pause. The whole room froze. "I read your interviews. I watched your Fox News clips. And I told myself, she's just another mouthpiece with a smile. But now I'm not sure. I don't agree with you. But I don't think I know you." Karoline didn't flinch. then tonight worked. More students began to raise their hands, not to shout her down, but to ask, to question. Some to even thank her for showing up when they had written her off. The moderator looked stunned. We were told this might get tense. There were security concerns. Faculty said it could be a hostile environment. Karoline smiled faintly. So I dressed for battle. She tapped her green blazer gently. Laughter. Real laughter now. Then applause. One student leaned over to his friend and whispered, "Dude, she won." But Karoline wasn't finished. "I want to leave you with something," she said, turning to the full room. "Not a campaign line, a story." She reached into her blazer and pulled out a folded slip of paper, soft, creased, clearly old. This was a note from my father. He gave it to me the day I went to D.C. to take my first job in politics. She unfolded it and read, "Be strong enough to speak, but be wise enough to listen. That's how you change the room." The room fell completely silent. Karoline held the paper for one more second, then tucked it away. "I didn't come here to win. I came to listen too. And I did." At that moment, the student who had shouted at the beginning, "She doesn't belong here," slowly stood, arms uncrossed. He didn't say a word. He clapped. The rest of the room followed, one by one. Then all at once, no chants, no signs, just standing, just hands, just respect. The sound of applause filled the lecture hall like a wave, uneven at first, then swelling into something undeniable. Not polite, not forced, but real. Karoline didn't smile widely or bask in the noise. She simply nodded once, gracious, steady, and stepped back from the edge of the stage. A professor near the back leaned over to another and whispered, "I've never seen anything like this." The moderator cleared his throat, caught between protocol and awe. "Miss Leavitt, would you stay for the full panel?" Karoline glanced at the rows of students, many still standing, a few with damp eyes, most stunned by their own reaction. "If you'll have me," she replied simply. The response came not in words, but in continued applause. A few faculty members clapped too, hesitantly, then with growing confidence. Even those who disagreed couldn't deny what they'd witnessed. A young woman, vilified before she even arrived, had just reshaped the narrative without shouting, without apologizing, and without backing down. She had done the unthinkable. She had earned their ears. Dana, the student liaison backstage, wiped her eyes discreetly. She turned to the staff member beside her and said, "I thought this would be a disaster. I thought they'd boo her out of the building." The staffer nodded, voice hushed. Instead, they're writing her into campus history. Back on stage, the student in the denim jacket who had challenged Karoline earlier raised her hand again. Not for a question, but to say, "You made me rethink how I approach people I disagree with. That takes strength." Karoline's response was short but sincere. "It takes pain first, then patience, then time." The lights in the auditorium, once harsh, seemed softer now. The protest signs that had once stood tall were gone. Some dropped to the floor. Others folded under chairs, forgotten. The panel continued, but Karoline wasn't just another guest anymore. She had become the moment. And that's when it happened. A student from the front row pulled out her phone, hit record, and said, "Westbridge just witnessed a masterclass in grace under fire." Within minutes, the video hit social media. Within an hour, number Karoline at Westbridge was trending. And by the time the final question was asked, the world had already begun to react. When Karoline stepped out of the auditorium doors, the sun was setting over Westbridge. The air smelled of autumn and anticipation. She hadn't even reached the sidewalk before her phone buzzed. Once, then again, then non-stop. Dana, the student liaison, rushed after her. "You're trending," she said, almost breathless. Karoline blinked. "Trending?" Dana held up her phone. A video. Karoline holding her father's note. Caption, "She came to be hated. She left respected." Another. A side-by-side of the crowd booing at the start and standing at the end. Caption, This is how you change a room. Karoline didn't speak. She just watched. From Washington to Wisconsin, from high schoolers to Hill staffers, the clips spread like wildfire. Even political opponents began retweeting her words, not to agree, but to acknowledge the moment. A liberal commentator wrote, "I disagree with every policy she supports, but I'd want my daughter to have her courage." A conservative senator posted, "This is why we believe in civil discourse. Karoline reminded America tonight." Inside the auditorium, students lingered in the aisles. Groups who had never spoken to each other exchanged thoughts. Some were still processing, some were shaken. All of them had just witnessed something rare, someone being heard without shouting. A campus paper released an early draft of their editorial. The headline, "We were ready to protest her, but then she listened, and we did too." Back in her car, Karoline sat alone for a moment. She wasn't smiling. She was thinking. She opened her father's note again, ran her thumb across the crease. "Be strong enough to speak. Be wise enough to listen." She whispered it once more, under her breath, as if anchoring herself to the memory. That night, a message came in from the White House. A senior advisor had watched the full panel. "The president wants to speak to you, tomorrow, Oval Office." But before answering, Karoline closed her eyes and exhaled, because it wasn't about the Oval. It was about the room she had just left behind, the one she'd walked into alone, and left not as an enemy, but as a voice. A generation had just met her, not through spin or scandal, but through truth. And they were still listening. The next morning, Karoline stood before the large double doors of the West Wing. Her breath fogged slightly in the early D.C. air. She wore the same green blazer from Westbridge, creased slightly now, but proud. The silver cross at her collar caught the sunlight like a spark refusing to dim. The aide at the desk gave a short nod. "He's ready for you." She stepped inside. The Oval Office, with all its myth and marble, never felt more still. And yet, somehow, today, it felt smaller, less imposing, as if what she had accomplished at a campus miles away had made this room, finally, her equal. President Trump stood near the resolute desk, arms folded, TV playing silently in the background. The footage looping was of Karoline, on stage, head high, eyes steady, reading the note from her father. The headline beneath, "Karoline Leavitt turns protest into applause." He turned. "You did it," he said simply. Karoline didn't blink. "I didn't win them over. I just made them listen." "That's more dangerous," Trump replied with a smirk. "You changed the conversation." He gestured for her to sit. "They didn't see you coming," he continued. "Young, female, conservative. They thought you were easy to dismiss." "They still do," Karoline said calmly. "Some will never forgive me for not matching their anger." Trump studied her for a long second. "That's why you're powerful." He leaned in. "We want to make this bigger. Next month, 5 more campuses. Ivy League, Midwest, California. I want that version of you. Unfiltered." Real Karoline hesitated. It wasn't nerves. It was weight. "I don't want to become a symbol," she said slowly. "Not one they can use or destroy. I want to stay human." Trump chuckled. "That's why it works. You don't pretend. You just walk into fire like you belong there." Karoline looked down briefly, at her own hands, still slightly trembling, from adrenaline, or from what came next. She wasn't naive. She knew every step forward would bring sharper knives. She knew social media would turn, flip, burn. She knew praise would be followed by distortion. That's how it always went. But she also knew something had shifted. Not just for her. For them. Back at Westbridge, students were already drafting op-eds not about policies, but about presence. Faculty were rethinking guest speaker policies, not to restrict, but to expand. A petition that once called to cancel her now had comments beneath it like, "She showed up. We didn't. That matters." Karoline rose from the chair. "Tell me the rules," she said. "Then tell me where I'm breaking them next." Trump smiled. "You're not just part of the next chapter," he said. "You're writing it." 3 days later, Karoline stood alone at her apartment window in D.C., looking out at the city she had once entered as a junior staffer, ambitious, underestimated, and untested. Now, her name was on the lips of every major commentator, from Fox News to CNN, from student papers to op-ed columns. But she wasn't celebrating. She was processing. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Invitations to speak at Yale, Berkeley, Michigan, requests for interviews, offers to write a book. The conservative base had already dubbed her the unshakable voice. Hashtags like #Gen Z leads and #Karoline challenge surged across platforms. But it wasn't the headlines she was thinking about. It was Ethan, the student in the wheelchair, the girl with the red hair, the protester who clapped, the professor who nodded. She thought about the way the room had changed, not because she yelled louder than they did, but because she didn't, because she listened, and made them listen in return. She turned away from the window, walked to her small bookshelf, and pulled out a leather notebook. Inside were clipped transcripts, faded family letters, and one folded note. The one her father gave her the day she walked into the West Wing. "Be strong enough to speak. Be wise enough to listen." She traced the handwriting with her finger. She now knew the weight of those words, not as slogans, but as scars. That evening, she posted a single tweet. No hashtags, no filter. You can't force people to agree, but if you show up and speak truthfully, sometimes they stay to listen. That's where change begins. In response, someone from Westbridge replied with a photo. It showed the auditorium door. A new poster had replaced the protest signs. It read, "She made us listen," whether we liked it or not. Karoline closed her laptop and smiled, not from pride, but from clarity. This was no longer about survival in politics, it was about responsibility, and she wasn't going to run from it. As she stepped outside that night, blazer on, cross shining at her collar, she wasn't walking into another battle. She was walking into the future, and for the first time, she wasn't just a press secretary, or a headline, or a target. She was a voice, and the country was still listening. In a world where voices are often silenced before they're heard, Karoline Leavitt did something extraordinary. She walked straight into a room that didn't want her, and left it standing in respect. This wasn't just a story about politics. It was a story about courage, about listening when you're being shouted at, about speaking when the world wants you silent, and about choosing grace when others expect fury. What happened at Westbridge University wasn't a speech. It was a turning point, because sometimes all it takes to change the room is to stay in it long enough. Thank you for watching, and if this story moved you, inspired you, or challenged the way you think, don't forget to subscribe, because this is just one chapter in a movement that's only getting started.